Hey everybody, this is the now quite late holiday video. Sorry about that. I've been getting interrupted by all manner of things, including sinus problems, had some technical problems I had to deal with. It's just been a bit of a mess, but regardless, here's the video. And it's not going to be a typical review or even really a typical MTO in the sense that the game I'm going to be talking about throughout the video is not finished, but I'm probably never going to actually review it because it's not exactly a game that is conducive to a standard review. I am, of course, talking about a game that's been in development for the better part of 20 years at this point. That is, of course, Dwarf Fortress, or Slaves to Armok God of Blood Chapter 2 Dwarf Fortress if you want to go with the original title. It's pretty much in a genre all of its own. There are games that have a lot of similar ideas to them, like, say, RimWorld or Going Medieval or something along those lines, but those are colony sims. They are much more narrowly focused than something like Dwarf Fortress, which is really more of a fantasy world simulation game. The whole colony sim part of it is really just that, a part of a much larger whole. The idea here is that when you start the game up, you generate a world, and you can select a bunch of parameters to generate that world with, and in the Steam version, the default is 100 years of history, although in previous versions it was 250 years of history, and you can go all the way up to 500 in the default settings, but presumably you can go even further than that if you really want to. Thing is, the higher amount of years you go, the longer it's going to take to generate that world. Because you have to remember, even with the original version having ASCII graphics, and even the Steam version having pretty simple 2D graphics, the game is still generating thousands upon thousands of individual characters, individual monsters, individual events, thousands of artifact items, dozens if not hundreds of settlements that rise and fall. It's just a ton of stuff that it has to generate, and so the more years of history that you tack onto that, the longer it's going to take, no matter what your system is and no matter how the game looks. This ultimately means that while the game does have a lot of common elements, like the general gameplay mechanics, and a lot of the same things are going to apply regardless of what world you're dealing with, each world is ultimately a unique entity, and every single time you go into this game, whether you're playing the Fortress mode or the Adventure mode, you're going to be experiencing very different things. So what does all of that entail? Well, let me go ahead and get some things out of the way first. The footage that you've been seeing throughout this video is almost exclusively of the Steam version of the game. In its current state, the only modes available in the Steam release are the Fortress mode and the Legends mode, which is really not so much a game mode as it is an encyclopedia of information about whatever world you've generated. Apparently there are still a few things they need to sort out with the Steam version of the Adventure mode, so it's not currently available in the Steam release, but once they get all that sorted out, then the Adventure mode will be added to the Steam release, and it will be just like with the older versions of the game that were available on the Bay 12 Games' website, and which are actually still available. If you want to play an older version of the game, then you can just go on the Bay 12 Games website and download whatever version of the game you want to mess around with. That's how I got the classic intro to show you at the beginning of this video, because that's not in the Steam release either. The Steam release is considered a sort of premium version, which gives you an official tile set, which gives it actual graphics instead of just ASCII characters being the graphics. It gives a mouse-driven interface, which is an absolute godsend, because the previous versions of the game were all keyboard only, which is not so great when you're having to deal with the very complex mechanics. And it includes a brand new soundtrack, which is a pretty fantastic soundtrack. In terms of actual game content and mechanics, it is the same as the version available for free on the Bay 12 Games website, however. So you have to ask yourself whether or not the $30 US or your regional equivalent for the premium Steam release is worth the investment. Well, I'll give you a recommendation at the end of the video, but before I do that, I have to explain to you what actually is in Dwarf Fortress to start with. The main two modes that you're actually going to be messing around with are the Adventure mode and Fortress mode. Adventure mode has you create a character and then venture off into whatever world you've generated to go on adventures. You explore strange locations, you fight various monsters, and ultimately you just travel the lands and forge your own path until eventually either your character ends up getting massacred by something, or you get to the point where you feel like that adventurer's wanderings are done and then you decide to retire them. The Adventure mode has its roots in traditional roguelikes, so you create your character, you wander off into the world and go on various adventures, and if that character ends up dying, well, that's game over for that character. You've got to create a new one if you want to keep going. But of course, you're not picking up where the previous character left off, you're going on entirely new adventures with this new character. And of course, because this is Dwarf Fortress, and Dwarf Fortress is a fantasy world simulation instead of just a game, you can do pretty much whatever you want with any given character that you make for the Adventure mode. You can stat them out pretty much however you want to, within certain limitations of course, and so they can have all kinds of skills, from simple things like being able to use a sword or an axe, to more complex things like being able to wrestle, which this game has a very elaborate wrestling system where you can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. And you can even fill out their skills with all manner of other things that aren't necessarily immediately relevant on an adventure, but might come in handy in the future, especially if they decide to become part of a fortress when you go over into the Fortress mode. Because that's another thing you can do with Dwarf Fortress. The world is consistent, so if you've got a fortress going in the Fortress mode in a particular world, and you decide that you want to give adventuring a try and want to try adventuring from that fortress that you've created, you can do that. This of course brings me over to the Fortress mode itself. What exactly do you do with that? Well, you start off by embarking in a location somewhere in the world that you've generated, and you will select your starting loadout of dwarves with their own specific skills and, of course, equipment and starting supplies and things like that, and then setting about creating a new dwarven outpost, which will gradually grow into a fortress, and if you get lucky, maybe even a full-on mountain home, where it becomes a pillar of whatever civilization your dwarves are a part of. Whether you want to build your fortress above or below ground, or a combination thereof, whether you want to build it out of wood or stone, or just simply carve into the mountain and throw a couple of doors on there and call it a day, that's entirely up to you. But regardless of how you build out your fortress, you need to keep in mind that your dwarves have needs. Of course, these are things like food or drink, but they also eventually will need things like religious facilities, as well as places to sleep, places to store their stuff, and perhaps most importantly, ways of staying safe against all manner of threats, whether it be just dangerous animals or monsters that come up from underground, or various threats from the overworld, whether it be goblin invasions or undead hordes that shamble in, or maybe even raids from humans or elves, depending on what your status is with those particular civilizations. And of course, there's also things like werebeasts that will show up out of nowhere and potentially cause all manner of damage to your fortress. So you need to make sure to get some defenses set up, things like basic traps or things like drawbridges to keep enemies out of your fortress and keep your dwarves in the fortress, or things like setting up and equipping militia forces so that they can go up against these various threats and actually attack them directly, or maybe even some more elaborate defensive projects, like maybe setting up a moat around your fortress so that the enemy has to traverse a large body of water to get to where your fortress is, or maybe even setting up elaborate mechanical systems so that the enemy shows up and then falls to whatever devious machinations you've set up. With one of the most entertaining being also one of the trickiest to set up, which is setting up a system to just dump magma on your enemies and then laugh maniacally as they melt. And while systems like that can be incredibly entertaining, they can also be incredibly dangerous to your fortress, because if you make one wrong move, then you might accidentally tunnel into an aquifer and end up flooding your entire fortress, or you might end up tunneling into things incorrectly with the magma setup, and suddenly you're flooding your fortress with magma, which is considerably worse. Because at least if your fortress gets flooded with water, it doesn't just instantly start melting all of your stuff into all of your dwarves. But whether you keep the fortress simple or you go for one of these so-called stupid dwarf tricks, each fortress experience is going to be unique, because, like with everything else, it is simulating basically everything as you go along. Every single creature has its own specific personality and needs, and there are even some random events thrown into the mix to help spice things up a bit. You might be suddenly invaded by something, or you might have enemies wander past your fortress but not actually attack it. You might have monsters come up from the depths below, and then from time to time you'll have things like dwarves going into strange moods and then crafting an artifact of great value, or potentially going completely insane if they don't have what they need to create that artifact. And because you don't have direct control over individual characters like you would in other colony sims like, say, RimWorld or something along those lines, things don't always go the way you intend, and sometimes things can get downright ridiculous, and it's usually in a very entertaining way. To give you a really wacky example of the kind of crazy stuff that can happen with Dwarf Fortress, I highly recommend you look up Boat Murdered. It is a cooperative let's play of Dwarf Fortress that has become somewhat legendary among the community, so much so that one of the songs in the Dwarf Fortress Premium soundtrack is called Koganusan, which is the dwarven name for Boat Murdered. But to give you some examples of the kind of things that have happened during my personal time with Dwarf Fortress, I've had my dwarves leave the fortress doors open for 2 entire years until eventually an undead horde showed up and just laid waste to the fortress, all because they refused to move the rock that was propping the door open. And I'm not sure what happened with one particular world I generated, but every single fortress that I tried to set up in that particular world suffered endless hardship under the talons of various birds that were constantly stealing random crap that was laying around the fortress, or just straight up attacking the dwarves, in many cases killing them outright. I mean, hell, with one particular fortress, I ended up losing 6 dwarves to a sparrow. And not even a giant sparrow, just a normal-sized sparrow, one of those absolutely tiny, completely harmless birds, managed to kill 6 dwarves, one of which was direct. It directly basically clawed a dwarf to death, and then the other 5 were panicking and ended up falling into a nearby swamp and drowned. And then there was one fortress I had that was actually doing quite well, until a panda decided to attack it and ended up slaughtering 6 dwarves in a fairly gruesome manner, and the nearby necromancers that had taken up residence at my fortress decided to start panicking, raised a few of those corpses as undead, and then those undead ended up slaughtering the rest of the fortress. And keep in mind, as ridiculous as these things are, they are some of the more mundane things that can happen in Dwarf Fortress. There are some truly amazing, ridiculous, wacky things that can happen because of how complicated the simulation in this thing gets. And the especially weird thing is that despite how deep the mechanics are and how complex everything is, there are really only 3 major hurdles to getting into Dwarf Fortress, and the first 2 of these were actually addressed with the Steam version of the game. Those are the graphics and the controls. In the original version of the game, and in an optional setting in the Steam release, the game practically didn't have graphics because it used ASCII characters for everything. Meaning that every single item, every single character, every single bit of the environments was represented by just a general character like you would type out when you're just doing some coding or something. The Steam version mitigates this directly by having an official tile set which is very clean and easy to read, and makes everything a lot more appealing with some very nice pixel art. The second major hurdle is the controls, another thing that was fixed in the Steam release, although there are still a few things that they need to iron out with it. Because in the Steam release, they added in mouse-driven interfaces, which are infinitely easier to use and much more intuitive than the keyboard-only controls that were present in the original version of the game. Controls which meant you had to just memorize a ridiculous number of hotkeys and try to work your way around the awkward targeting system that had, meaning the adjustment period for getting used to Dwarf Fortress's controls was pretty much astronomical with the old release. Not a problem with the Steam version and its mouse-driven interfaces. Again, they still have a few things they need to iron out with it, but generally speaking, it all works very well now. So what's the third hurdle? Well, that one's going to be one that's either completely insurmountable or a complete non-issue for you. And that is that Dwarf Fortress is an extremely niche game when you get down to it. As I said before, there are very few games that are even remotely close to it, and the ones that are generally are much more narrow in focus. I mean, as much as I enjoy RimWorld, for example, it is just a colony sim when you get down to it, and it's on a much more micro scale than the kind of stuff you see in Dwarf Fortress. Dwarf Fortress is ultimately a fantasy world simulation game that has everything being simulated down to a very minute amount of detail. It is, frankly, kind of insane to think about, and because there's just so much going on under the hood there, and there's so many things you can mess around with, the possibilities are practically endless with it. Adventure mode runs can be everything from hilarious, ridiculous, very short stories of abject failure, all the way up to truly epic, world-altering adventures and everything in between. Fortresses can be everything from just simple settlements that are built around farming or maybe running an inn, all the way up to massive, heavily populated fortresses with extremely elaborate layouts and all manner of mechanisms and traps and such to keep the fortress safe. Said fortresses can last for years and years before being successfully, in air quotes, retired and becoming basically a fixture of the world, or they can fall in any number of ways, whether it be through epic struggles, or they can be brought to ruin in a completely ridiculous and hilarious manner that you'll end up telling stories about for who knows how long. The de facto mantra of the game is losing is fun, and it is really the only game I can think of off the top of my head that actually lives up to that. Where the idea of a fortress failing or an adventurer falling can be so hilarious that you can't help but just want to keep going just to see what else you can do. And if somehow the ridiculous amount of stuff in Dwarf Fortress is not enough for you or is not to your liking, there are a ton of mods out there that are compatible with both the original version that was on the Bay 12 Games site and the Steam version, taking what was already practically infinite replayability and making it even more infinitely replayable. And all of that makes Dwarf Fortress one of the most amazing gaming experiences I have ever come into contact with. But despite how amazing the game is, the amount of people who can actually get something out of playing Dwarf Fortress is actually pretty limited. Some people just aren't going to gel with the game no matter how hard they try, whether it be because they just can't wrap their heads around it, because they just don't have the patience for it, or because they, for whatever reason, just can't get past the graphics or the general control scheme or whatever the case may be. And in the time since I've been made aware of Dwarf Fortress, I've really come to the conclusion that it's the kind of game you either absolutely love or you absolutely hate, at least in terms of actually playing it, and there's barely any in between there. It's all really dependent on whether you can get past those initial hurdles of the controls, the graphics, and the overwhelming feeling that the complexity of the game initially gives you. Because there really is a ton to take in there, and even though the game does have extensive documentation on the wiki, and now the Steam release has an actual tutorial that helps you get things up and running, there's simply so much complexity under the hood that a lot of people just aren't going to be able to wrap their heads around it no matter how hard they try. But I can tell you for certain that the Steam version definitely helps a lot with that. It gives you some tutorials to help get you started with the absolute basics of getting Fortress mode up and running. It has tips that explain how certain mechanics work as you navigate through the menus, and the mouse-driven interface is infinitely more usable than the keyboard-only controls that the game previously had. Although it does still have some issues, namely things like the trading screen, which is just not good, and they definitely need to retool that. And also things like the adventure mode not being available in the Steam version until they sort out whatever issues they're having with it and patch it back in. But really, at the end of the day, there's never been a better time to at least try to get into Dwarf Fortress, if you've been at least somewhat interested in it over the years. Sure, the Steam version isn't perfect, and it's still got some things that are missing and need to be fixed, but it was clearly designed to alleviate a lot of the accessibility problems that Dwarf Fortress has been plagued with over the years. And if the game seems interesting to you, then that $30 asking price for the Steam version is well worth the investment, because it makes the game a hell of a lot easier to pick up and play than if you were to go to the Bay 12 Games website and just download the free version, which is still available, I might add. They are still releasing updates for the game for free, and if you want the so-called Classic Edition, you can just go onto their website and play with that, and it's only ASCII graphics, unless you use mods, of course, like the Lazy Noob Pack. But of course, if you go and mess around with that version, then you're going to find it is a hell of a lot more difficult to get into, so much so that if you don't use the Lazy Noob Pack, it is damn near impossible to get into. And even with the Lazy Noob Pack, it is still an absolute pain to try to get into the classic version of the game. Obviously, if you're already used to it, or if you have the sheer patience for it, then it's not that big of a deal. But for basically everybody else, the Steam version is really going to be the way to go, or I guess the Steam and itch.io version, because it's also on itch.io. So ultimately, if you are interested in Dwarf Fortress, and I haven't scared you off with talking about how complex the game can be and how rough it is to try to get into, I would say go ahead and pick the game up, whether you decide to go all in and try the original classic version of the game and just dive into the deep end of the mess, or try to ease yourself in with the considerably more accessible Steam version. Regardless of which of those you choose, you will find the experience of Dwarf Fortress really unlike anything else. Even games that do very similar things to Dwarf Fortress, like, say, RimWorld, which is probably the closest one to it in terms of complexity, really pale in comparison to just how much is being simulated in Dwarf Fortress, so the experience really is quite unique. There really isn't anything else quite like Dwarf Fortress. And since the possibilities are basically endless, you can really get effectively infinite playtime out of it, and it's going to be well worth the investment, regardless of whether that investment is the time of trying to learn the controls of the original version, or money in the case of the Steam version. But if you know for a fact that you're not going to be able to get past the visuals or the interface, or just don't have the patience for a game like this, then you're not necessarily going to get nothing out of Dwarf Fortress entirely, because there are ways of experiencing the wonders of Dwarf Fortress secondhand. I mean, I've already mentioned the wackiness of something like Boat Murdered, which is just an absolutely wonderful read, and there's even somebody who's done a complete read-through of that on YouTube if you don't really want to just read it and you'd rather have a sort of audiobook format. And then, of course, there are things like the various Let's Plays that Krug Smash has done, which are really more storytelling experiences than anything else. They're really not traditional Let's Plays. And, of course, there are plenty of other people who have done more traditional Let's Plays where they take things in a much more mechanical manner, and pretty much everything in between. And because you can really get effectively infinite enjoyment out of the game in one way or another, whether you're actually playing it or just experiencing it secondhand, Dwarf Fortress really is the gift that keeps on giving, and that's ultimately why I decided to cover it for the holiday season this year. I mean, sure, I normally do a review for special occasions, and this isn't really a review, but nor is it a normal My Thoughts on video, because this really isn't the kind of game that is conducive to that kind of format. Because if you try to do a deep dive into the mechanics, well, you're basically going to be there all day, and that's still not really going to cover what Dwarf Fortress is really all about, which is ultimately the stories that it creates, and that is going to be a wildly subjective experience no matter who you are. So again, I would say that if after all of the things I've said thus far about Dwarf Fortress you're still interested in giving it a try, go ahead and give it a try. Like I said, there's really never been a better time to try to get into Dwarf Fortress now that the Steam version's out and is considerably more accessible than the so-called classic version. But if you're more on the fence about it, or you know for certain that it's really not your kind of thing, then I would say you can still probably get some at least second-hand enjoyment out of it by looking into some of those Let's Plays and ultimately having those stories told to you. Whatever the case, I'll have links to the game in the video description box to where you can pick it up either the Steam version, which is what I would ultimately recommend, or the classic version if you're willing to put up with the extreme learning curve there. Thank you all very much for watching, and thanks for bearing with me on this video. I know it is very late compared to when the holidays actually were, but the last couple of weeks have just thrown a monkey wrench into all my plans, and I've been trying to play catch up ever since. Here's hoping that things become more stable in 2023, especially considering that I have some really fun things planned for the new year, so stay tuned for all of those. And of course I will have a teaser going up that'll show some of the things that I have planned for the new year, although a lot of it is going to be catching up on some projects that I've had going for a while, so stay tuned for those as well. Thank you all again for watching, and thanks again for bearing with me during all the delays and such, and I will see you all in later videos.